Have you ever stopped to think about the most extreme punishments history has ever known? Humanity has a long track record of severe punishments, and as strange as it may seem, many of these methods were once considered normal in certain eras. From public punishments to surprising forms of chastisement, authorities seemed to have no limits when it came to making someone pay for their mistakes. And that is exactly what you are going to see here today. So go ahead and drop your like, click the subscribe button below, and let's get started. The pear of anguish was a device used with the purpose of inflicting an extremely painful and humiliating punishment. The device looked like a pear, with metal segments that opened when triggered by a key or spring. Its function was simple but cruel. The device was inserted into the victim's body, which could be the mouth or other areas, and then expanded, causing immense discomfort and pain. The idea behind this punishment was to force the person's body to gradually open, causing unbearable pain and, often, hemorrhages. When the mechanism was activated, the segments would open, stretching the orifices of the person receiving it. This process could last for a prolonged period, making the experience even more distressing. The victim was typically bound to the device, with the suffering intensifying as the pressure increased. The intent was for the punishment to be not only physical, but also psychological, since the insertion and expansion process was accompanied by extreme humiliation. The punished person was usually naked, which heightened the emotional impact of the punishment even more. Additionally, the intense pain and side effects of the punishment could lead to death, as the stretching of tissues and bodily injuries could result in serious internal damage. This type of punishment was used in the Middle Ages against women accused of witchcraft, adultery, liars, blasphemers, and homosexuals. The severe punishment was seen as a way to control or subjugate individuals, and many did not die in the process, often experiencing only the beginning of a series of other tortures yet to come. The concept of such a brutal and devastating punishment remains an example of how humanity, in darker moments of its history, developed extreme methods to punish and subdue those deemed transgressors. Dismemberment has been used throughout history as a cruel form of punishment, especially in authoritarian and merciless regimes. This method involved the removal of parts of a person's body, usually in a brutal and fatal way, as punishment for severe crimes like treason, regicide, or murder. Although the methods vary according to culture and era, dismemberment as a form of punishment or execution generated horrors recorded in the darkest pages of history. In the Roman Empire, for example, the practice of quartering involved dividing the victim's body into 4 parts, which were then publicly displayed as a warning to those who dared to challenge authority. This practice was widely used to punish traitors to the crown, with the body displayed as a warning to others. In Asia, particularly in India and Southeast Asia, dismemberment was a traditional form of punishment for those who committed serious crimes against the state or society. One notable example was the use of trained elephants to carry out executions, where the animals, fitted with sharp blades on their feet, dismembered those condemned in front of a crowd. This type of execution had a public character, designed to intimidate the population and reaffirm the power of authority. However, one of the most notorious and brutal forms of dismemberment took place in medieval Europe, especially in the Kingdom of France. During the reign of Louis XIV, the execution known as 4 horses became famous. The technique involved tying the condemned person's limbs to 4 horses that, once spurred, pulled in opposite directions, tearing the victim's limbs off. This type of punishment took place in public squares with the aim of humiliating the condemned and setting an example for the population. Dismemberment as a punishment was also carried out in symbolic ways, such as in the case of leaders who, after being executed, had their bodies divided and the parts displayed in public places. One example of this was the execution of Tupac Amaru II, leader of a revolt in Peru against Spanish rule. After his execution in 1781, his hands and feet were tied to horses that were released in the 4 directions of the square, separating his limbs. Over time, practices like these were abandoned due to the evolution of justice systems and the growing movement against punishment and the death penalty. However, dismemberment as a form of punishment left a grim legacy in history. As a punitive practice has been used throughout history in various ancient cultures and civilizations. This brutal method consisted of removing the skin from a human being, serving as both punishment and execution. Its use as punishment was not limited to a single historical period, but spanned ancient times, having been documented in empires such as the Assyrian Empire and during the Ming Dynasty in China. The reason flaying was chosen as punishment lay in its extreme cruelty and ability to cause intense suffering to the victim, both physically and psychologically. Often, comparison, flaying was reserved for crimes deemed serious, such as treason, rebellion, or disrespect for authority. The execution served as a terrifying message designed to discourage any attempt to disobey laws or challenge the power of rulers. During the process, the victim was often bound, immobilized, and then the removal of the skin began. This type of punishment caused horrific pain, and death could occur in various ways. The main cause of death was circulatory shock due to excessive blood loss, but it was also possible for the victim to die from infection or hypothermia, since once the skin was removed, the body was left vulnerable to such dangers. In some cases, death could take from a few hours to several days, depending on the severity of the flaying. Flaying as a punitive practice has also been documented in more recent times, especially associated with Mexican cartels. In recent years, reports and images of cartel victims being flayed have become known through investigations and media records, considered one of the cruelest ways to punish someone. The punishment of being buried alive is a practice that provokes horror and revulsion, considered one of the cruelest forms of execution or punishment humanity has ever witnessed. This punishment consists of confining the victim in a grave, pit, or other underground space and covering them with earth while they are still alive, condemning them to a slow and terrifying death by asphyxiation, dehydration, or crushing. Used throughout history by different cultures, live burial symbolized not only a death sentence but also the denial of dignity in death. In ancient Rome, live burial was reserved for cases considered exceptionally severe, such as the crime of breaking the vow of chastity among the Vestal virgins, priestesses dedicated to the goddess Vesta. Those women who had sworn purity if they broke their vows were placed in an underground chamber with a small amount of food and water to prolong the agony. The practice carried deep religious and cultural weight, seen as a way to appease the gods. In the Middle Ages, the punishment of being buried alive was occasionally used as punishment for crimes like adultery, military desertion, or treason, often in proceedings involving public trials, to ensure the execution served as an example. For instance, in some regions of Europe, women convicted of adultery could be buried up to their necks, remaining alive while awaiting death from starvation or animal attacks. In more recent times, live burial has also been recorded as a method of punishment and chastisement in contexts of war, genocide, and organized violence. During the Second World War, documented accounts showed that Japanese forces, especially during the occupation of China, used this practice as a brutal punishment against prisoners of war and civilians. Criminal groups such as Mexican cartels have also been linked to the use of live burial as a form of extreme intimidation. The terror of this punishment resides as much in the physical suffering as in the psychological agony of the victim, who faces the despair of confinement and the imminence of death with no possibility of escape. The use of hot pepper as a form of punishment was also employed in the past and stands out for its brutality and the extreme suffering it causes. Although apparently harmless in a culinary context, pepper, especially in its hottest varieties, became a frightening punishment tool. In modern times, this practice re-emerged in its most cruel form in the hands of criminal organizations. One case that shocked the world was recorded in 2017, involving the sons of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, leader of the Sinaloa cartel. According to the United States Department of Justice, one of the victims captured by the Chapitos was punished with the insertion of a corkscrew into his muscles, while hot peppers were applied to his open wounds and nostrils, causing significant pain to those considered enemies of the cartel. Scaphism, also known as the boats, was an execution method described as one of the most sadistic forms imaginable. Originating in ancient Persia, it was mentioned in historical accounts, particularly in the writings of Plutarch. The practice involved trapping the victim between two boats, or in a similar wooden structure, leaving only the head, hands, and feet exposed. Then, the person was forced to ingest large amounts of milk and honey, while the same liquid was spread over the body, especially on the exposed parts. This combination attracted insects that began to feed on the skin and laid eggs in the condemned person's flesh. In addition, the milk and honey consumed led to intense diarrhea, which accumulated waste inside the container, creating an unbearable environment filled with rot and worms. Scaphism was designed to bring about an extremely slow and painful death, with accounts of some victims surviving more than 15 days before succumbing to dehydration, infection, and overall suffering. One of the most famous cases was that of Mithridates, a soldier condemned by Artaxerxes II after killing the king's brother. According to reports, Mithridates suffered for 17 days before finally dying. Scaphism still has a cultural impact today and can be found in literary works, films, and series, where it is often portrayed as an example of the brutality of ancient times. Public flogging was a widely used form of punishment in different historical periods, mainly during the Middle Ages and the colonial era. This type of punishment aimed not only to inflict pain on the convicted person, but also to humiliate them in front of society, serving as an example for others. Usually, the punishment was carried out in public places, such as central squares or alongside specific structures like pillories, which symbolized municipal authority and jurisdiction. In Europe, flogging was administered with rods or whips and often preceded by a formal sentence, frequently carried out by municipal councils or religious authorities. Those condemned were tied to pillories or columns made of stone or wood, where they remained exposed in view of the people while receiving the blows. In colonial Brazil, public flogging was widely used, especially against enslaved people, criminals, and those considered deviants from the social norms of the time. Public squares and markets often served as the stage for these punishments, aiming to intimidate other enslaved people or citizens. This cruel practice also laid bare the system of inequalities and repression, further emphasizing the colonial and patriarchal power structure. Although it fell out of use in the 19th century, mainly after abolitionist movements and liberal reforms, public flogging left a profound mark on history. Look, humanity has come up with some pretty strange things over the course of history, but few are as frightening as the so-called Judas cradle. Despite the seemingly harmless name, there is nothing comfortable about it. In fact, it was one of the cruelest punishment instruments, supposedly created back in the 16th century by the Spanish Inquisition. And, as with anything involving the Inquisition, you can already guess it was far from pleasant. The Judas cradle was a device that looked like a chair with a pyramid-shaped tip. Supposedly created by Ippolito Marsili, an Italian from the 16th century, this instrument was designed with the goal of causing intense and prolonged pain to its victims. The punishment began when the person, usually naked and already humiliated by the exposure, was placed on top of the chair so that one of the body's orifices was positioned over the sharp tip of the pyramid. To ensure that the suffering was slow and prolonged, the victim was suspended and then gradually lowered with ropes or chains, so that the pressure and pain increased as the weight of the body pressed the tip of the device against the person's body. The main goal of the Judas cradle was not just to cause extreme physical pain, but also to stretch and tear the body's orifices. This stretching caused severe hemorrhages, which ultimately led to the victim's death. The victims were usually exposed without clothing as an additional form of degradation, making the psychological suffering just as intense as the physical pain. The punishment was not just a bodily punishment, but also a way to crush the spirit of the person experiencing it. Although the Judas cradle is often associated with the Spanish Inquisition, there are some details about its history that still spark debate among historians. While some claim the device was indeed used, others believe it may be a myth or an exaggerated invention, created in later times to illustrate the Inquisition's brutality. Nevertheless, it is undeniable that its image has endured as a symbol of the extreme suffering caused by these social control institutions. In addition to the Judas cradle, there are references to other similar punishment devices, such as the wooden horse used in Prussia, especially in a military context. However, the wooden horse had a slightly different goal. While the Judas cradle aimed to impale and stretch the body's orifices, the horse was mainly used to punish unruly soldiers, causing intense pain to their genitals without breaking the skin. Even so, both devices share the same idea of physical punishment and public humiliation, symbolizing an era in which violence was used as a means of control and chastisement. The Iron Maiden is a punishment device consisting of a metal structure resembling a sarcophagus, lined on the inside with sharp spikes. The victim, when placed inside the Iron Maiden, stood upright as the hinge door was closed, forcing the body against the spikes. These spikes were not designed to cause immediate death, but to pierce parts of the body like the arms, legs, chest, and abdomen, causing immense suffering. The structure was built in such a way as to keep the victim alive, prolonging the torment. Some versions of the device had small openings, allowing those responsible to observe the prisoner, or even adjust the door's pressure, intensifying the punishment. The Iron Maiden was used as a means of extracting confessions or simply as a severe punishment. This device became associated with torture chambers, and was also feared for its psychological impact, since simply seeing the Iron Maiden instilled terror in anyone who realized they might become a target of such punishment. It also became very present in pop culture, later being depicted in several films and series that you have probably seen at least once. Electrocution as a method of punishment is a form of chastisement that uses electrical current to cause pain and suffering to the individual being punished. This practice has its roots in various forms of physical punishment and has been applied at different times in history in several countries, including in some prison systems. In its application, the victim was subjected to intense electric shocks, which could be administered in different ways. In some versions, the person was placed in an electric chair or subjected to devices connecting electrodes to their body. The electrical current passed through the individual's body, causing acute pain, involuntary muscle contractions, and, in more extreme cases, permanent damage to tissues and internal organs. In Brazil, while the use of electrocution as a form of punishment was never officially recorded in the criminal justice systems, there is evidence that this method was used clandestinely in certain historical periods marked by repression. During the military dictatorship, for instance, electrocution became a widespread tool in detention and torture centers. In these facilities, political prisoners, activists, and regime opponents were subjected to punishment sessions that included electric shocks, often administered to sensitive parts of the body. These practices aimed not only to extract confessions or obtain information considered valuable by the authorities, but also to break the spirit and psychological resistance of detainees, instilling fear and submission. In addition to being brutal methods, these actions left deep physical and emotional scars on their victims, perhaps representing one of the darkest sides of a tense and complicated chapter in history. Although electrocution was initially used as a technique of control and intimidation, it is now widely condemned in many countries due to its harmful effects on health, and using it as a form of punishment is considered a crime. Do not forget to subscribe so you can watch more videos like this.